Important Supreme Court cases. Let's start in 1803. Let's start with Marbury versus Madison. John Adams, on his way out of office in 1801, appoints a lot of new federal judges. Remember, federal judges serve for life. The Federalists were on their way out of power. Adams and other Federalists realized the best way for them to hold on to some political power when Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson took over in the White House and the Democratic Republican majority took over in Congress was to appoint some federal judges. So, with the Judicial Act of 1801 and John Adams' midnight appointments of the midnight justices, he fills a lot of these newly created federal judge positions with, as you can understand, Federalists. Thomas Jefferson becomes president, James Madison becomes Secretary of State. One of Madison's jobs as Secretary of State is to deliver letters notifying people when they've received a federal job. For example, if you've become a federal judge. Well, Madison takes a number of those letters and just sticks them in a drawer, says, I'm not even going to tell those Federalists that they have been appointed to a federal judge position. One of those guys is William Marbury. He sues Madison for the job that he's been told he rightly has earned. And in the summary of the decision, the court struck down the law as unconstitutional on which Marbury had based his case. This is the first time this has happened. The Supreme Court has declared the law unconstitutional. This establishes an important policy in the United States government, and that's the policy of judicial review. The Supreme Court has the power to rule a law that it is considering in a Supreme Court case to be unconstitutional. And it's like that law is wiped out. It's like that law never existed. And this policy, judicial review, does not exist in the Constitution. It was given to the judicial branch in the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. Next, let's jump to 1824. Let's look at Gibbons versus Ogden. A New York state law gave two individuals the exclusive right to operate steamboats on waters within state jurisdiction. A steamboat owner who did business between New York and New Jersey challenged the monopoly that New York had granted, which forced him to obtain a special operating permit from the state to navigate on its waters. So the question before the court is, did the state of New York overstep its authority on a power reserved exclusively to Congress, namely the regulation of interstate commerce? And what the court found was that New York law was invalid by virtue of what we call the Supremacy Clause, which states that the federal law supersedes or trumps any state law. The Commerce Clause can be applied to a lot of areas. Congress, not the states, has the power to regulate interstate commerce. And the Commerce Clause is very big. Big, broad view of what exists as commerce. Next, let's jump to 1857. Let's look at Dred Scott versus Sanford. Why is this case so important? Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom after his master moved him into a free territory, Wisconsin. The Supreme Court ruled against Scott. The ruling had three major points. The first was that slaves were not U.S. citizens, so they had no right to sue. The second was that slaves are property, and the government cannot take away a man's property or prevent him from moving it. Therefore, Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories. In other words, in 1857, the Supreme Court, dominated by Southerners, said that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which banned slavery north of that southern border of Missouri, said that that Missouri Compromise was null and void. It threw it out. And finally, that the federal government does not have the right to free slaves brought into the territories. Staying with the issue of civil rights, let's look next at Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This Supreme Court case decision is important because it is the Supreme Court saying that the Jim Crow laws found throughout the South are constitutional, that separate but equal institutions are constitutional, that legal segregation of races is allowed, acceptable, and constitutional. Next, let's look at Korematsu versus United States in 1944. Why is this case so important? In this case, this is when the Supreme Court ruled that interning Japanese Americans during World War II, even those Japanese Americans who were citizens born in the United States, was legal. Now, later, the government will apologize for this action and pay reparations to the survivors or descendants of those people interned. But at the time, the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal. We just talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1954, the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education is going to unanimously overturn that Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. In Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court states that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And in schools, it has lasting negative impacts on white and black children. And that the schools should be integrated with all deliberate speed. Next, let's jump to 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright. The next two have to do with the rights of the excused. What Gideon versus Wainwright does is mainly extend the rights of the accused in federal courts, which were robust and strong, especially because of the Bill of Rights. It extends all those protections from the Bill of Rights and from other federal laws. Those protections for the accused in federal courts are extended to people accused in state courts and to people accused in local courts. One of the biggest ones is that defendants must have lawyers provided. Before Gideon versus Wainwright, lawyers were always provided in federal court cases for defendants. That was not always the case in state courts and in local courts. Gideon versus Wainwright is going to make that federal law at the state and local level as well. We say it's been incorporated. In 1966, in Miranda versus Arizona, the rights of the accused are expanded to include no interrogation and no confession from a suspect without an attorney present. And if a suspect confesses to a crime, says something in an interrogation without being informed of their right to have an attorney present, then that can be thrown out in court. Jumping ahead a few years to 1973, Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court in this decision used the Fourth Amendment as a basis to legalize first trimester abortions. The court ruled that states cannot outlaw abortions during that period. And this is probably one of the most controversial rulings that is still in effect today. It was a divided court in the 1970s. It would probably be a divided court if it came up again today. Let's wrap up with a look at United States versus Richard Nixon from 1976. Why is this decision so important? Well, during the Watergate scandal, President Richard Nixon tried to assert that his executive privilege, which is a power that the president has to withhold information from investigators because it's information that's vital to him doing his job as chief executive. President Nixon asserted that his executive privilege made him immune from subpoenas requesting the release of White House audio recordings. The court ruled that in this case, Nixon had no such privilege. This case had the lasting impact of asserting that even the president is not above the law. Insert modern political commentary here.